Why distance lost its meaning. Distance once felt absolute. Far meant separate. Near meant connected. That assumption shaped how reality was understood for centuries. Influence faded with space. Effects weakened with separation. What happened here could not instantly matter there. Distance protected independence. To understand why this certainty collapsed, we need to return to how deeply space structured intuition. Objects occupied locations. Forces traveled across gaps. Information moved step by step. The universe felt local, orderly, and safely compartmentalized. This picture worked beautifully at human scales. Voices faded with distance. Touch required closeness. Even light took time to travel. Separation felt real because it was experienced everywhere. Every human sense reinforced conviction that distance created independence, and that what was far away was, by that very fact, disconnected from what was near. But beneath that comfort, physics was uncovering something unsettling. Certain systems refused to behave independently, no matter how far apart they were placed. Separation did not erase connection. It merely hid it. The connection was not visible in the way that forces and signals are visible. It did not travel across space or consume time. It simply persisted, a relationship that distance could stretch but never sever. At first, these effects were dismissed as coincidence. Correlations happen. Patterns emerge. Surely distance would reassert itself once measurements improved. Surely space would reclaim its authority. Instead, the opposite happened. The farther systems were separated, the clearer the pattern became. Outcomes matched with uncanny precision. The correlations were not approximate or statistical. They were exact, as though the separated systems were consulting a shared script that had been written before they were pulled apart. Not because information traveled faster, but because the systems behaved as if distance did not matter at all. This was deeply troubling. Physics had always relied on locality. Causes act nearby. Effects spread outward. Distance enforces delay. But here were results that respected every speed limit while quietly ignoring separation. The first realization was subtle but devastating. Distance limited signals, not relationships. Space constrained motion, not correlation. The universe allowed connections that did not weaken with miles, meters, or galaxies. Distance was still measurable, still real, but it was no longer fundamental. And once that possibility emerged, space itself stopped feeling like a barrier and started looking like a background that connections could quietly ignore. At first, physicists searched for hidden messengers, some unnoticed signal, some subtle exchange slipping past detection. Distance had always meant delay, and delay required a carrier. If outcomes were linked, something had to be traveling, but no signal was found. Timing checks closed every loophole. The correlations appeared instantly, yet no information moved between the systems. Speed limits were respected perfectly. No information was transmitted. No signal crossed the gap. The fundamental constraints on communication and influence remained completely intact. Yet the correlations persisted with an exactness that defied every attempt at local explanation. Distance was not being crossed. It was being bypassed. This created a deep conflict. Physics had always assumed that separation guaranteed independence. If systems were far enough apart, they could be treated as distinct. But these results refused that assumption. The systems behaved as parts of a single whole, regardless of space. The key realization was unsettling. Distance limits influence, not correlation. You cannot use these connections to send messages or control outcomes, but you also cannot remove them by pulling things apart. The relationship was built in from the start. As understanding grew, space began to look less like a divider and more like a coordinate system. It told you where things were, not how independent they were. Separation described geometry, not relationship. Emotionally, this was difficult to accept. Distance had always felt like protection. Far away meant disconnected. Now physics was revealing a universe where separation did not guarantee solitude. By this point, locality was no longer absolute. It worked for forces and signals, but not for everything. The universe obeyed speed limits while quietly maintaining connections that space could not weaken. Distance still mattered, but it no longer meant what we thought it did. The conflict deepened when physicists realized these connections were not rare or fragile. They were fundamental. Created together, systems remained linked no matter how far they were separated. Distance did not dilute the relationship. It merely stretched it. This buildup forced a radical shift in perspective. Space was no longer the ultimate organizer of reality. Two objects could be light years apart and still behave as a single system in crucial ways. What mattered was not where they were, but how they were related. This did not mean the universe was chaotic. The connections followed strict rules. They could not be used to cheat causality. No messages traveled faster than light. No control crossed the gap. Yet the correlations were precise, unavoidable, and immune to separation. Emotionally, this was deeply unsettling. It meant that independence was not guaranteed by distance. Isolation was not automatic. The universe could remain unified even when stretched across unimaginable scales. As this understanding settled, space itself began to look secondary, a way of labeling positions, not a way of enforcing separation. Geometry described layout, but relationships were defined elsewhere by deeper constraints that space alone could not break. The true organization of reality was not spatial but relational, a network of connections that persisted beneath and beyond the three-dimensional arrangement of objects in space. By this point, the meaning of distance had quietly changed. It still described how far things were apart, but it no longer described how unrelated they were. The universe had revealed a deeper order, one where connection could survive separation, and where space was not the final word on what mattered. The climax of the story is a quiet but profound shift. Distance did not disappear because physics broke its rules. It disappeared because it was never the rule that defined connection. Once this is understood, space stops being a wall and starts being a map. It tells us where things are, not how separate they truly are. The universe enforces speed limits on influence, but it does not require independence to come with separation. This insight reshaped how reality is modeled. Systems are no longer defined solely by location. They are defined by relationships. Two objects can be distant in space and inseparable in description. What matters is not the gap between them, but constraints that bind them together. More deeply, it reshaped humility. Humans evolved to treat distance as safety, separation as isolation. Physics revealed a universe that does not share that instinct. Connection can be fundamental, not optional. Unity can persist without proximity. Today, this understanding quietly underpins modern physics and technology. It informs how information is defined, how systems are secured, how reality is modeled at its deepest levels. Distance still shapes experience, but it no longer defines possibility. Why distance lost its meaning is not a story about space failing. It is a story about connection outrunning intuition. The universe was never as divided as it looked. And once that is seen, separation stops feeling absolute. It becomes a detail, important, measurable, but no longer decisive. The universe is more deeply connected than its spatial layout suggests. And the true structure of reality is found not in the distances between things, but in the relationships that bind them together regardless of where they happen to be. Subscribe to join the journey. Why